I'm afraid there won't be a wedding today. I have something to say first.
That was the first thing Remy Callahan noticed when the gunfire started. But that came later. Everything that mattered came later. What came first was silence. The particular silence of a woman standing alone in a room full of flowers or wearing a dress that cost more than her first car, listening to the distant hum of an organ playing something beautiful and entirely meaningless. The bridal suite in the basement of St. Augustine's smelled of aerosol hairspray, stale lilies, and the sour tang of anxiety that no amount of expensive perfume could fully mask. Remy stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at the woman looking back at her. The dress was ivory tulle and stiff lace structured within an inch of its life, the kind of gown that required two people to zip and a third to adjust. It had cost $11,000. Seth's mother had selected it. Remy had simply stopped arguing somewhere around the third boutique. Her hair was pinned in an intricate twist at the nape of her neck. Her lipstick was a muted rose. Her mascara was waterproof, which would turn out to be the single most useful decision she made that entire year. 10 more minutes, her mother had said, patting Remy's cheek with a cool, dry hand before slipping out to manage the caterers. 10 more minutes and you will be Mrs. Seth Wolf. Remy had smiled. She had been smiling for months, smiling at engagement parties and cake tastings and seating chart arguments that lasted until midnight. Smiling while Seth complained about the budget and his mother complained about the venue, and Petra, her best friend since college, complained about the color of her bridesmaid dress while secretly wearing it better than anyone in the room. The smile had become a kind of muscle memory, a reflex, a survival mechanism. She stood alone now, and the smile was gone, and without it, her face felt oddly unfamiliar. She needed Seth. He had a way of standing close enough that the noise in her head quieted. She needed that quiet. She hoisted the heavy skirts, the fabric rustling like dry leaves in October, and slipped out of the suite. The basement hallway was dim. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing everything in a sickly yellow that turned the white walls the color of old bone. The groomsman's dressing room was around the corner, past the storage closets in the ancient air conditioning unit that rattled like it was arguing with itself. She heard it before she understood it. A rhythmic sound, wet, deliberate, coming from behind a heavy wooden door left open by exactly 1 inch. Remy stopped walking. Her brain, primitive and loyal and desperate to protect her, screamed at her to turn around, to go back to the stale lilies and the buzzing lights and the waterproof mascara and the 10 more minutes and pretend the hallway was empty and the sound was nothing, was the pipes, was the ancient church settling on its foundation, the way old things do when they have been standing in one place for too long. Her feet did not listen. She leaned toward the gap in the door. The air seeping through was warm. It smelled of bleach and damp mop strings, and Seth's cologne, that sharp, woody scent with bergamot underneath that she had bought him for Christmas 2 years running. And beneath it, cloying and unmistakable, was the artificial strawberry of Petra Sinclair's body lotion, the one she ordered in bulk from some boutique in the West Village, the one that had been sitting on Remy's bathroom counter for 3 years because Petra was always leaving things behind. A voice, high, thin, breathless, Seth's name. Then Seth's voice, the one that had whispered promises in the dark, the one that had said forever over cold pasta at a tiny restaurant 3 years ago on a Tuesday when neither of them had anywhere to be, and the night had felt like it could hold any shape they wanted to give it. Almost, Seth said, just wait. The movies lied to you about betrayal. There is no soaring orchestral music, no dramatic collapse, no slow motion moment where time stretches out to give you room to feel what is happening. What actually happens is this. Your stomach turns over once hard and sudden like a car engine refusing to catch. Saliva floods your mouth hot and metallic. Your vision narrows to a single irrelevant detail. For Remy, it was the linoleum floor. Scuffed beige tile, a black mark shaped like a crescent moon near the base of the door. She stood there and looked at that crescent moon and felt something inside her go very, very quiet. Not broken, not devastated, not the theatrical collapse of a woman destroyed by love. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a body finally stops pretending. She heard the rustle of clothing, the metallic clink of a belt buckle hitting an aluminum bucket inside the closet. Petra's voice breathless and frantic. We have to go. She is going to be looking for you. Let her wait, Seth said. Remy backed away from the door. Her heels made no sound on the linoleum. She did not run. She walked methodically, one foot in front of the other, back down the buzzing hallway, back through the door of the bridal suite, and she locked it behind her with a sharp, heavy click that sounded like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She stood in front of the mirror, muted rose lipstick, intricate twist, waterproof mascara. She looked exactly like the woman she was supposed to be. She felt like a gutted fish left on a dock. One tear spilled over, hot and stinging, dragging a single black line down her cheek. She watched it in the mirror. She did not wipe it away. She let it ruin the makeup. Let it leave a raw red mark on the pristine surface of everything she had been carefully maintaining for longer than she could honestly remember. Someone knocked. "Remy, honey, it's time." She stared at her reflection for 5 more seconds. The nausea receded. What replaced it was something colder and heavier and far more dangerous than grief. It settled into her bones like concrete setting in winter. She grabbed a tissue, spat on it, scrubbed the mascara from her cheek until only a raw red smear remained. "Coming," she said. Her voice sounded flat, perfectly controlled, like a door closing. She unlocked the door. The organ music hit her first, a suffocating wave of sound that rattled the stained glass and vibrated in her molars. Her father materialized beside her in the dim hallway, sweating through his rented tuxedo, his hand clammy where he linked her arm through his. "You look beautiful, kiddo," he whispered. His voice was tight with a nervousness he had no idea was entirely misplaced. She tasted bile at the back of her throat and said, "Thanks, Dad." The heavy oak doors opened. 200 faces turned toward her. 200 sets of eyes, expectant and admiring, and entirely unaware that the woman in the $11,000 dress walking toward them had already made a decision that none of them were going to see coming. The red carpet runner stretched ahead of her like a tongue. At the end of it stood Seth Wolf in a perfectly fitted tuxedo, sandy hair, swept back, wearing an expression of practiced awe that she now recognized as the same face he used when he was about to close a difficult sale. Beside him, a few feet to the left, stood Petra Sinclair in blush pink silk. Her lips were slightly swollen. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere above the altar and would not meet Remy's eyes. Remy walked. Every step sent a bolt of pain up her calves from the satin heels. She welcomed it. The pain was real. It was specific. It kept her anchored to the floor of the church instead of floating up into the vaulted ceiling where none of this would matter. Her father kissed her cheek and handed her over. Seth reached for her hands. His fingers were warm and slightly damp. "You're shaking," he whispered, leaning close. The bergamot and wood smoke cologne hit her. Underneath it, faint but unmistakable, a ghost of artificial strawberry. "You look perfect." She looked at him, really looked at him, saw the slight asymmetry of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his pupils were dilated with adrenaline. A stranger, a pathetic, calculating stranger she had cooked dinner for and argued with about paint colors and trusted with 3 years of her one life. The priest began. Remy did not hear a word of it. She was watching the microphone clipped to the priest's lapel, a small black clip-on mic feeding into the speakers mounted in the rafters above 200 unsuspecting heads. "And so if anyone present can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The ceremonial pause. Half a second, a formality. Nobody ever speaks. Remy pulled her hands out of Seth's grip. "I have a cause," she said. Her voice was not loud. In the sudden cavernous silence of St. Augustine's, it cracked through the air like a whip. The organist hit a dissonant note and stopped entirely. Seth's practiced smile dissolved into raw, confused blankness. "Remy, what are you doing?" he said. She turned toward the congregation. 200 faces, no longer smiling. She looked at Petra. The color drained from Petra Sinclair's face so fast she looked like a woman made of chalk. Remy leaned slightly toward the priest's lapel mic. The speakers overhead popped with static. "He has been sleeping with the maid of honor," she said. Her voice was calm and clear, and carried to every corner of the church with the perfect acoustics of a building designed to amplify important announcements. "In the supply closet, approximately 20 minutes ago. She still smells like artificial strawberry body lotion, if anyone would like to verify." The collective intake of breath from 200 people sucked the oxygen out of the room. Somewhere in the third row, Seth's mother produced a strangled, high-pitched sound. Seth grabbed Remy's wrist. His grip was hard and bruising, the pleasant warmth of his hands entirely gone. "You're insane," he hissed, his face going mottled and furious. "You're ruining everything. Shut up." "Let go of me," she said. His grip tightened. Before she could pull free, before the murmurs rippling through the pews could erupt into full chaos, something happened that nobody in the room was prepared for. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church did not open so much as surrender. They hit the stone walls with a crack like a gunshot that made 200 people flinch simultaneously. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in the span of a single breath. Remy looked down the long red aisle. 4 men walked in. They wore suits. Not rented, not ill-fitting, not the kind of suits that existed to mark an occasion. These were dark, meticulously tailored garments that moved with their owners like a second skin, heavy and fluid, and entirely purposeful. The 3 men behind walked with their hands loose at their sides and their eyes scanning the pews with a clinical precision that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with threat assessment. But it was the man in front who took the air out of the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that blocked the light from the vestibule. Dark hair clipped short at the sides. A jaw that looked like it had been engineered rather than grown. He moved across the red carpet without making a single sound, a quality so absolute it did not seem physical, so much as intentional, as though silence was something he chose and maintained the way other men maintained posture. He was walking toward the altar with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of something older and more instinctive. The silence of 200 people recognizing on a level below conscious thought that they were in the presence of something genuinely dangerous. Seth let go of Remy's wrist as if her skin had caught fire. She looked at him. He was trembling, actually physically vibrating, the sweat visible now at his temple rolling down to soak his white collar. His eyes were fixed on the approaching man with an expression of pure, unfiltered terror. "Oh God," Seth whimpered. His knees appeared to be considering giving out. The man reached the altar. He did not acknowledge the priest, did not scan the crowd, did not spare a glance for Petra still frozen in her blush-pink dress like a woman who had been turned to salt. He looked at Seth Wolf with eyes so dark they appeared to have no color at all, flat, lightless. When he spoke, his voice was a low, graveled sound that vibrated in the floor beneath Remy's feet. "Hello, Seth," said Dominic Harrow. "I believe you owe me something." The priest had backed himself against the marble altar, as if hoping the stone would absorb him. Dominic stood in the center of the sanctuary and adjusted his cufflinks. The faint platinum click of the mechanism was the only sound in the room. Seth's voice came out cracked and pathetic, the voice of a man who had spent months playing at being powerful and was now confronted with the actual thing. "I have the money, I just need a few more days. The wedding gifts, the accounts, I was going to pay you back tomorrow." Dominic tilted his head a single fraction of an inch. A sharp, cynical expression touched the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was something a blade might do if it found the situation mildly interesting. "Tomorrow," he repeated, tasting the word like something he had found in bad condition. "You stole $3 million from my shipping account, Seth. You ran it through a shell company, registered in the Cayman Islands, bought yourself an imported sports car, and appear to have used the remainder to fund this rather elaborate production." He gestured vaguely and dismissively at the floral arrangements. At the tool, at the towering white cake visible through the reception hall doorway, at 200 terrified people sitting in their rented chairs. "You do not have $3 million in envelopes on the gift table." A woman in the front row. Remy's aunt began to cry quietly. One of Dominic's men turned his head toward the sound without moving any other part of his body, and the crying stopped instantly, replaced by a held breath that lasted the remainder of the afternoon. Remy stood in her heavy, suffocating dress and watched Seth Wolf come apart at the seams. The numbness inside her deepened, crystallized into something that felt almost like clarity. Her life was a wreckage, an absolute crater. And yet she could not look away from the man who had walked into it. He smelled of rain on hot asphalt and something expensive underneath, sharp and metallic. He brought the air pressure in the room down with him, the way a storm front does, gradual, and then all at once. "Please," Seth said, dropping to his knees on the red carpet. The sharp crease of his tuxedo pants broke. He pressed his palms together. "Mr. Harrow, please. I'll sell the car. I'll sell the house. I'll get the money." "The house is mortgaged beyond its value," Dominic said, with the particular tone of a man reviewing a list he finds deeply tedious. "The car covers a fraction. You are, Seth, entirely bankrupt in every sense that word can be applied to a human being. Dominic shifted his gaze. He looked at Remy. His dark eyes moved over her with a slow, careful attention that had nothing romantic in it and nothing dismissive either. He took in the raw red mark on her cheek where she had scrubbed away the mascara, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched at her sides, completely still not shaking. He looked at her the way a man looks at a map when he is trying to determine whether it is accurate. "I heard your announcement," Dominic said. His voice changed register, slightly lower, meant only for the two of them despite the crowd of 200 pressing in on all sides. A bold decision, exposing him at the altar. She met his gaze and held it. "He burned it down," Remy said. "I just handed out the matches." Something moved in his expression, brief and carefully contained. A spark of something that might, in another man, in another situation, have been genuine amusement. He turned back to Seth. "Stand up," he said, the pleasantness entirely gone. Seth scrambled upright, swaying. "I am going to take everything from you," Dominic said quietly. "The car, the house, the accounts, your credit, your professional standing. I am going to ensure that you spend the remainder of your life looking over your shoulder at shadows and working cash jobs that leave no paper trail, because you will never again in your life be trusted with anything that can be documented." He paused, let the words settle. Then he looked back at Remy. "I have a problem of my own," he said. "My grandfather is a traditional man. He controls access to a network of family trusts and port operations that I require for the next stage of our business. He will not transfer that control until I am in his word settled. A family man, he considers it a matter of character." Dominic's expression conveyed precisely what he thought of this requirement. "I have no interest in courtship and no patience for the women who circle my world looking for leverage. But I find myself needing a wife, immediately." Remy looked at him. The gears in her exhausted, hollowed-out brain turned over slowly. "You want to marry me?" she said. It was not a question, it was an assessment delivered in the same flat tone she used when a client presented her with a strategy that was simultaneously absurd and the only available option. "A business arrangement," Dominic said. "1 year. You attend family functions, you play the role, you maintain the appearance. In exchange, I clear whatever financial damage this situation has left you with. I establish a trust account in your name that will make you independent for the remainder of your life. And I give you a front row seat while I dismantle everything Seth Wolf has ever owned or hoped to own." Seth made a strangled sound behind her. "You cannot do this," he said. "Silence," Dominic said without looking at him. The word landed like a stone dropped from a great height. Seth's teeth clicked together audibly. Remy looked at Seth. He was staring at her with wide, desperate eyes, silently begging her to say no, to be the good and reasonable woman he had always assumed she fundamentally was beneath whatever temporary madness had taken hold of her at the altar. She looked at Petra, still frozen, still unable to meet her eyes. Then she looked at Dominic Harrow. There was no warmth in the offer, no comfort, no pretense of anything other than what it was cold and transactional offered by a man who was by any reasonable definition a monster in a tailored suit. But she was done being the reasonable woman, done being the one who managed her expectations and smoothed over the cracks and smiled at engagement parties until her face ached with the effort of it. If she was going to walk into hell today, she might as well hold the devil's hand. 1 year, she said. The corner of Dominic's mouth curved. It was a dangerous expression, breathtaking in the way that a storm system is breathtaking, something you cannot look away from, even while understanding it has the capacity to level everything in its path. 1 year, he said. He extended his hand, large, the knuckle slightly marked, a heavy silver ring on his index finger. She did not hesitate. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and warm and left absolutely no room for renegotiation. He looked over her shoulder at the priest. "Father." Skip the homily, the vows. Father Terence looked as though he might swallow his own collar. He was a small, pale man whose knuckles had gone entirely white where he gripped his leather-bound Bible, and he looked between Dominic and Remy and the weeping heap of Seth Wolf on the red carpet with the expression of a man who had not signed up for any of this when he entered seminary 40 years ago. "The vows," Dominic said again. Quieter. More dangerous for the quiet. "Yes, yes, of course." The priest did not open the book. His Adam's apple moved in his throat. "Do you, Dominic Harrow, take this woman?" "Remy Callahan," she said. "Take Remy to be your lawfully wedded wife." "I do," Dominic said. He did not look at the priest. He watched Remy with dark, assessing eyes. "And do you, Remy Callahan, take Dominic?" "I do," she said before the priest could finish the sentence. "The rings Father Terence managed." Dominic looked at Seth. The ring, Seth. The sound Seth Wolf made was not quite a word. He reached into his tuxedo pocket with fingers that were visibly shaking and produced the small velvet box that had been sitting there since that morning, waiting for a ceremony that had gone entirely off its intended course. He fumbled with the hinge, dropped it, retrieved it from the red carpet, held it out with both hands like an offering. Dominic did not take the box. He waited. The understanding crossed Seth's face slowly and painfully. He opened the box, removed the ring with trembling fingers, white gold thin band, small cloudy diamonds. He held it out. Dominic took it between his thumb and forefinger. He turned to Remy, took her left hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. By the power vested in me, the priest said the syllables running together in his haste to be done with this. I pronounce you husband and wife. You may. Dominic stepped closer. His scent reached her first. Rain and hot asphalt and something metallic underneath. The artificial strawberry and the bergamot that no longer belonged to any good memory. All of it displaced, replaced. She braced herself. He leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheekbone. Barely a touch, a fraction of a second. Breathe, he said, against her ear. His voice was low and entirely private. You look like you are about to pass out, and I do not carry brides. He straightened. The hard angles of his face gave away nothing. He turned to the congregation. Thank you all for coming, he said, his voice filling the rafters. The reception is canceled. He placed his hand against the small of her back, right where the bone of the corset dug hardest, and he did not ask if she was ready. He simply moved her forward, and she moved, and they walked back down the red carpet together in absolute silence. 200 people watched them go. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The only sound in St. Augustine's was the distant rattling of the ancient air conditioning unit and the quiet, undignified sound of Seth Wolf still on his knees on the red carpet crying into his hands. The afternoon sun hit Remy like a wall the moment they came through the oak doors. Beautiful day. Cloudless May sky. Traffic humming on the street below. A woman walking a golden retriever on the opposite sidewalk, entirely indifferent to the fact that Remy Callahan's entire life had just been rebuilt from the foundation up in the span of 40 minutes. A black SUV idled at the curb, heavily armored, tinted windows turning the afternoon into permanent dusk. One of Dominic's men pulled the rear door open without being asked. Dominic guided her in. She gathered the ridiculous skirts and folded herself into the leather seat. He followed, pulling the door shut with a solid final sound that muted the city completely. The interior smelled of conditioned leather and something faintly medicinal, cool and dim and hermetically sealed from everything outside. Dominic leaned forward and tapped the glass partition. Home. The car moved. Remy looked out the tinted window as the stone steps of St. Augustine's rolled past. Seth had stumbled out of the doors and was standing on the top step, both hands in his hair, looking frantically at an empty street. She watched him until he disappeared. Then she turned away from the window and looked at her hands in her lap. The cloudy little diamonds on her left hand caught the muted light and threw off small, pathetic glints. The adrenaline was draining out of her bloodstream. What it left behind was a cold, hollow ache in every joint and the beginning of a bone-deep exhaustion that felt like it had been building for much longer than one afternoon. You can take the pins out, Dominic said. She looked at him. He had already opened a slim tablet and was reading lines of text with his expression entirely detached. He was not looking at her. She raised her hands to her head and began pulling the heavy metal pins from the twist at the nape of her neck, dropping them one by one into the cup holder between their seats. They hit the plastic with small, sharp sounds. Click, click, click. What happens now? She said. Her voice sounded raw and unfamiliar to her own ears, like a room that had been emptied out. Dominic did not look up from the screen. Now you become Remy Harrow, he said, and we get to work. The drive lasted 45 minutes. The city dissolved behind them as they climbed into the hills north of the city, trading clogged highways for winding roads lined with old oaks. The car turned onto a private drive, stopped before iron gates that swung open without anyone touching them, and rolled onto a property that looked nothing like a home and exactly like what it was. A compound. Built for function, designed to be defended. The house was glass and dark stone and steel cut sharply into the side of a ridge. No flower beds, no fountains. The landscaping was brutally precise, clean angles of concrete and low shrubs and lights positioned to eliminate every shadow on the approach. Remy counted 4 cameras before the car even stopped. Dominic stepped out without waiting. She gathered her skirts and followed her heels grinding on the crushed gravel, the cool evening air cutting through the thin lace at her sleeves. Inside, polished gray slate floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking dark pines, a space designed to be scrubbed clean of evidence. A woman waited in the foyer, late 50s, gray dress, silver hair pulled back with military severity. She stood as though her spine had been installed by someone who took the work seriously. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrow." Not a flicker of surprise at the woman in a wedding dress standing beside him. "Constance, this is Remy. She will be in the primary suite. Have her belongings transferred from her apartment by morning." The woman Constance looked at Remy with a measuring gaze that lasted exactly 2 seconds and ended in a small professional nod. "Dominic," Remy said. His name felt strange in her mouth, like wearing a coat that belonged to someone else. "My apartment. Seth is on the lease. He has the keys." Dominic paused at the base of a floating glass staircase. He looked back at her. A brief, genuine flash of irritation crossed his face, the first expression she had seen on him that had not been entirely controlled. "By the time my people arrive, Seth will not present any difficulty," he said. "Constance will show you up. I have calls to make." He turned and walked down the hallway and was gone, and Remy stood in the middle of a glass fortress in $11,000 worth of silk and tulle, and felt the specific weight of what she had done settle over her like a second dress. Constance gestured toward the stairs. Remy followed. The primary suite was at the end of the second-floor corridor. Enormous, a king bed with dark charcoal linen. Windows offering an unbroken view of the pines below, black shapes against the darkening sky. No photographs, no books, no personal objects of any kind. It looked like a luxury hotel room designed for a person who planned to leave before dawn. "There is water in this bathroom," Constance said. She left without further comment, pulling the door shut behind her with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been closing doors on difficult situations for a very long time. Remy sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress barely moved beneath her. She looked down at her hands. The ring. Those small, cloudy diamonds that had cost Seth 3 months of car salesman commissions and which had seemed until approximately 2 hours ago like a reasonable symbol of a reasonable future. The dam broke. Not gracefully, not cinematically. It was ugly and violent and ripped out of her chest in a way that doubled her over her hands, clutching the stiff tool while she gasped for air and let 3 years of carefully maintained reasonableness come apart all at once. 3 years. 3 years of adjusting her schedule and her expectations and her opinions to fit around a man who had been doing this, who had been using her best friend's strawberry body lotion long enough that Petra kept the spare bottle in the bathroom like it was a shared subscription. She cried until her ribs ached, until the remaining mascara burned her eyes, until there was nothing left in her chest but a dry, scoured silence that was almost peaceful in its emptiness. She needed the dress off. She stood and reached behind her back, searching for the zipper hidden beneath the row of decorative pearl buttons. Her arms were shaking. The fabric was too stiff. She twisted and pulled until the lace burned red marks into her shoulders, but the zipper did not move. The bedroom door opened. Dominic walked in holding a glass of water. He stopped a few feet inside the room. He looked at her, at the ruined face and the red marks on her shoulders, and the way she was clawing at her own spine with the frantic determination of someone who had run entirely out of patience. "I cannot get it off," she said. The humiliation of saying it out loud was sudden and absolute. He set the water on the nightstand, crossed the room. His footsteps made no sound on the thick rug. "Turn around." She turned. His fingers moved to the nape of her neck, brushing aside the loose, tangled strands of hair. The touch was clinical, precise. He found the top of the zipper. "Hold your breath." She did. He pulled the zipper down in one smooth, continuous motion. The metal teeth parted with a sharp sound, and the corset released, and $11,000 worth of pressure lifted off her ribs all at once. She let out a long, ragged breath, her shoulders dropping 2 inches. "Thank you," she whispered. He stepped back. "There are towels in the bathroom, something to sleep in on the counter. Breakfast at 7. Do not be late." She turned to look at him, holding the bodice against her chest. He was already looking at his phone. "Dominic," she said. He paused, looked up. "Why me?" she asked. The question had been sitting in the back of her skull since the altar, patient and insistent. You could have paid any woman to do this. You could have hired an actress. Why step into that particular mess? He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. His dark eyes moved across her face in the dim light, reading something she was not aware she was showing. Because an actress would have hesitated, he said. His voice had dropped to something quieter, something that felt less like strategy and more like an actual thing a human being was saying to another human being. When I walked into that church, I offered you a lit match. You did not blink before you threw it. I do not need someone professional, Remy. I need someone who already knows how to burn things down. He turned, walked out, pulled the door shut behind him with a quiet final click. She stood alone in the large impersonal room, holding a dress she never wanted against her chest, looking out at the black pines against the dark sky. She woke to the smell of black coffee and the fading sound of a helicopter rotor dissolving into the distance. 10 seconds of staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. Then it all came back, not gradually, but all at once. The closet, the church, the lit match, the contract, the tears. She sat up. She was wearing a white dress shirt that swallowed her whole stiff cotton, smelling faintly of expensive laundry detergent. Her wedding dress was gone. Someone had come in while she slept and removed it without waking her, which told her something important about how quietly the people in this house moved. She found black leggings and a gray cashmere sweater folded on the chair in the corner. Constance's doing. She put them on and went downstairs. The kitchen was industrial and enormous, all stainless steel and dark marble. Dominic was at the island counter, dark gray, suit tie already precise, laptop open, coffee steaming at his elbow. He did not look up when she walked in. Coffee is in the carafe, eggs on the stove. She poured a mug, sat 3 feet away from him. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, and she drank it with both hands wrapped around the mug and felt it work. "Sleep well?" he asked, still looking at the screen. "Like the dead," she said. He closed the laptop with a decisive click and looked at her. In the harsh morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the faint darkness beneath his eyes was visible. He had not slept much. She filed that away. He slid a thick manila folder across the marble toward her. "Your new life," he said. She opened it. A marriage certificate, a new driver's license bearing the name Remy Harrow, a stack of legal documents detailing the transfer of $3 million into a trust account in her name. She stared at the number for a moment. It did not feel real. It felt like a prop in a production she was still figuring out her lines for. Beneath the financial documents was a dossier, 3 pages of typed notes. "What is this?" she asked. "The rules of engagement. My grandfather, Walter Harrow, arrives in the city tonight. We have dinner at his Long Island estate tomorrow evening. You need to have memorized that dossier before we arrive." She pulled the pages out and read. Details about Walter Harrow, the structure of the family business, and a fabricated romantic history, precise and detailed and entirely fictional. According to this, she said, "We met in a coffee shop 6 months ago. I spilled an iced latte on your shoes." "It is a credible origin story," Dominic said, finishing his coffee. "Walter is a cynic, but he has a weakness for traditional romantic narratives. You will tell him you were intimidated by me initially, that my persistence won you over, that you kept the relationship private because you were extricating yourself from a previous engagement. A complicated one. So we are leaning directly into the reality of it. We are weaponizing the truth," he said. "The story of what happened at St. Augustine's is already moving through the family network. It makes you appear impulsive, passionate, and fiercely protective of your own dignity. Walter respects all 3 of those qualities to a significant degree." She set the papers down. She looked at him steadily. "And if he does not believe it, if he looks at me and sees exactly what this is?" Dominic's expression closed over like a door being sealed from the inside. The brief human quality of the morning conversation was gone. What replaced it was the thing she had seen walk down the red carpet of St. Augustine's. Cold, predatory, entirely without uncertainty. "If Walter does not believe it, my uncle Vincent will use the doubt to challenge my succession," he said. "If Vincent challenges successfully, the Eastern Port Network locks down. If the ports lock down, we lose significant revenue weekly, and the people who depend on that revenue will look for someone to hold responsible. I do not lose Remy, and I do not carry liabilities." He placed his hands flat on the marble and leaned forward. "You will convince him that you belong in this family. Do you understand what I am telling you?" The weight of it settled over her, slowly like water rising. She had not signed a contract. She had walked into a war zone, and she had done it in satin heels on the worst day of her adult life. "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady despite the cold fist closing in her chest. "But I have one condition." His eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger, something closer to attention. She held his gaze. "Do not lie to me," she said. "I will memorize your script. I will convince your grandfather. I will stand next to you in whatever room you need me to stand in, and I will be exactly what this situation requires. But behind closed doors, you tell me the truth about every danger I am walking into. No shadows, Dominic. If someone is coming for you, I need to know where to stand so I do not get caught in it." The kitchen was completely silent. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of sustained, unblinking attention that most people cannot hold. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not the blade-like expression from the church. Something different. Something that looked briefly and genuinely like respect. "Deal," he said. He stood, took the laptop, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. Remy sat alone in the enormous cold room. The fake love story spread on the marble in front of her. The real one, barely 12 hours old and already more complicated than anything she had agreed to. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the dark tree line below the ridge, the pines motionless in the early morning air, the whole world looking like it was waiting to see what she was going to do next. She pulled the dossier toward her and began to read. The dress for the Long Island dinner was the color of dried blood. Remy stood on a low platform in the middle of a fitting room on the second floor of the compound, while a seamstress named Beatrice moved around her with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something. The silk clung rather than draped. Long sleeves, high neckline, but the back dropped entirely to the base of her spine in a clean, uninterrupted line that left nothing to the imagination except everything it was strategically choosing not to show. Beatrice moved with a mouthful of silver pins, adjusting the hem with small, precise movements. She smelled of starch and peppermint, and she had not made eye contact with Remy once since she arrived, which Remy was beginning to understand was simply how people in this household operated. Eyes down, work done, no unnecessary contact. "Is the back strictly necessary?" Remy asked, shifting her weight slightly. Her calves were still sore from the satin heels 2 days ago. "It feels exposed." Dominic was standing at the window overlooking the motor court below. He had been there since she walked out from behind the changing screen, and he had not looked at her since. He wore a charcoal suit over a black shirt, no tie, and he was watching something in the courtyard below, with the particular quality of attention he seemed to apply to everything total and unhurried and giving nothing back. He turned at her question. His gaze moved from the hem of the dress, up the line of her spine to the tight bun Constance had pinned her hair into that morning. The temperature in the room did not change, but something in it did. "My Uncle Vincent will be at the dinner tonight," he said. His voice was flat and informational. "He expects me to have married someone frightened, someone impulsive who will shrink when challenged. He will be looking for the crack in the facade from the moment we walk in. The dress communicates that you have nothing to be ashamed of and no intention of hiding." He crossed the room toward her. Beatrice took 2 precise steps backward, a movement so practiced it was clearly habitual. Dominic stopped behind her. In the full-length mirror at the end of the room, Remy watched him raise his hand and let his knuckles graze lightly along the base of her bare spine, a single brief contact that was entirely clinical and somehow the most unsettling thing that had happened to her since the church. She did not move, but something in her chest did. "You are shaking," he said. His voice was low and private, not for the room. "I am terrified," she said. In the mirror, she could see the line of his jaw, the controlled stillness of his expression. "I am a marketing manager from Queens, Dominic. I do not know how to negotiate with people like your uncle." "You are not going to negotiate," he said. He held her gaze in the mirror. "You are going to sit beside me, smile when my grandfather speaks. Ignore Vincent entirely unless he addresses you directly, and if he does, you look him in the eye, and you answer him the same way you answered Seth in that church. No hesitation, no apology, no shrinking." He stepped back. The absence of his warmth was immediate and oddly disorienting. 10 minutes, he told Beatrice. "Finish it." The drive to Long Island took just over an hour. Rain came in from the coast somewhere around the halfway point, smearing the highway lights into long red and yellow streaks against the tinted glass. The partition between them and the driver was up. The rear cabin felt sealed and pressurized, a small, dark world unto itself. Remy sat with her hands in her lap and ran her thumb along the inside edge of the ring on her left hand. The cloudy diamonds. Seth's ring. Dominic had told her to keep it for now. The story required a hasty, passionate elopement. A new ring too quickly would raise questions. She understood the logic. She hated the ring anyway. "Stop touching the ring," Dominic said. He was reading from his tablet, face lit by the cold blue glow of the screen. "You have been doing it since we left the compound." It reads as nervous. "I am nervous," she said. "I am aware. Stop letting it show." She put her hands flat on her thighs. She looked out at the rain on the glass and thought about the dossier she had spent the previous day memorizing. The cover story. 6 months ago, a coffee shop in Midtown, an iced latte, a ruined pair of shoes, and a man who apparently pursued her with a persistence that eventually overcame her better judgment. 3 dates before she agreed to anything. 4 months of quiet, private courtship before she accepted his proposal. No social media, no public appearances, because she was still disentangling herself from a previous relationship that had become untenable. All of it plausible, none of it real. And yet, sitting in the sealed dark of his car while rain hit the glass and the highway lights bled past, it did not feel entirely foreign either. She pushed that thought away. 3 years, she said quietly, not meaning to say it aloud. Dominic glanced up from his screen. 3 years, she said, again. We shared a bank account. We argued about what kind of dog to adopt. We had a whole imaginary life planned out in detail. And I did not know. Dominic clicked off the tablet and set it in the seat back pocket. He looked at her with the measured attention he applied to everything. People see what they need to see, he said. It is not a flaw, it is a function. You wanted the life you had built in your head, so your perception arranged the available evidence to support it. It is the same mechanism that keeps most people functional. That is an extremely clinical way to describe being made a fool of for 3 years. It is practical, he said. In my world, that mechanism gets people killed. In yours, it simply gets them humiliated in a church in front of 200 people. The underlying architecture is identical. She turned to look at him directly. The retort died in her throat. The car was slowing. Through the rain-blurred window, she could see stone gateposts topped with carved lions, their faces worn smooth by decades of weather. The gates opened without anyone touching them, and the car rolled onto a long gravel drive lined with old oak trees that had been growing here longer than anyone currently alive could remember. The estate came into view around a curve in the drive, Tudor style, stone and dark wood. The kind of house that did not announce its wealth so much as simply embody it the way a mountain embodies altitude, without effort, without apology, as a simple condition of existing. The car stopped. The door was opened by a man in a black raincoat who materialized from somewhere in the dark. Cold, salt-tinged air rushed in. Dominic stepped out first. He positioned himself so that his broad shoulders blocked the worst of the wind while she climbed out a gesture so subtle it could have been coincidental and was almost certainly not. "Shoulders back," he said quietly. "Eyes up. Do not look down at anything for any reason." She straightened her spine and took the arm he offered, and they walked toward the lit entrance together. The inside of the house smelled of roasted garlic and old wood smoke, and decades of cigar smoke baked permanently into expensive Persian rugs. A chandelier dripped crystal light onto dark oak paneling. An actual butler in an actual vest took Dominic's coat without making eye contact with either of them. They walked down a long corridor, their footsteps absorbed by thick carpet runners toward the sound of voices. The dining room was enormous. A mahogany table that could seat 20 stretched down the center set tonight for 5. 3 people were already in the room. At the head of the table, Walter Harrow. He was smaller than she had expected. Frail, hunched in a high-backed leather chair, with a silver-tipped cane leaning against the armrest, and an oxygen tank sitting quietly at his right foot. His suit was dark and impeccable, and clearly old, the kind of garment that has been kept in exactly the right conditions, because the person who owns it understands that some things are worth preserving. He had Dominic's eyes, the same flat, dark assessing quality. But where Dominic's were sharp with calculation, Walter's were layered with something deeper. Decades of watching people make decisions, decades of knowing which ones mattered. To Walter's left sat Vincent Harrow, late 50s, double-breasted suit a quarter-inch too tight across the shoulders, hair slicked back with enough product that it reflected the chandelier light. He held a glass of amber liquid in one hand and was already watching the doorway when they entered, which told Remy everything she needed to know about how long he had been waiting for this moment. "Dominic," Walter said. His voice was a wet, rasping thing that nevertheless filled the room without effort. "You are late." "Traffic on the bridge," Dominic said. He guided Remy forward with the hand at the small of her back, unhurried, as though arriving at a fortified family estate in the rain, to introduce a wife acquired 48 hours ago at someone else's wedding was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. "I would like you to meet my wife," he said. "Remy." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Walter leaned forward on his cane. His clouded eyes moved over her in a slow, thorough assessment that stripped away the oxblood silk and the careful posture and whatever controlled expression she was managing to maintain. She remembered what Dominic had said in the car. Eyes up. She held Walter's gaze and did not look down. "Remy," Walter said. He turned the name over in his mouth as though testing its quality. "Not Italian." "No, sir. Mostly Irish. Some other things mixed in." Vincent let out a short sound that was technically a laugh. "Some other things," he said. "That might be the most diplomatic summary I have ever heard of what happened at St. Augustine's the other day." He set his glass down with a deliberate click. "I heard you made quite the entrance, sweetheart. Walked out on the car salesman mid-ceremony and drove off with my nephew before the ink on the license was dry. You move fast." The heat that moved through Remy was not embarrassment. It was the specific and clarifying fury of a woman who has been called sweetheart by a man who means it as a diminutive and who has run entirely out of patience for managing other people's comfort at the expense of her own accuracy. She unlinked her arm from Dominic's. She stepped forward and placed both hands flat on the polished surface of the mahogany table and leaned toward Vincent with a calm that surprised even her. "My fiancée was having sex with my maid of honor in a supply closet while my father stood in the hallway waiting to walk me down the aisle," she said. Her voice was level and quiet and carried to every corner of the room. "I did not make a spectacle. I eliminated a liability. I have always preferred men who deal with their problems in the open rather than hiding them behind other people's closed doors." Vincent's smirk did not disappear, but something around his eyes tightened. She turned to Walter. "Dominic told me exactly what this family is," she said. "He did not soften it. He did not manage my expectations or protect me from the reality of what I was agreeing to. I did not marry him because I had no other options. I married him because he is the only man I have ever met who looks at a difficult situation and deals with it completely, and I decided I wanted to be on the side of the table that wins." The silence stretched. Walter was perfectly still. His clouded eyes had not moved from her face. Then he began to laugh. It started deep in his chest and came out as a wet, wheezing sound that traveled into a dry, breathless chuckle. He tapped the base of his cane against the floor twice. "She has teeth," Walter said. He looked past her to Dominic with something in his expression that might have been approval, the particular approval of a man who rarely has reason to give it. "I like her, Gabe. She is too thin, and she looks like she needs a proper drink, but I like her. Sit down, both of you." Remy pulled her hands from the table. Her palms had left two faint damp prints on the mahogany. She pressed them against the invisible seams of her dress and took the chair Dominic pulled out for her. Dinner was served. She did not taste any of it. She moved through the mechanics of the meal, cut and lift and chew and swallow, while tracking every conversation in the room simultaneously. The heavy red wine they poured helped blunting the sharpest edges of her anxiety without dulling the alertness she needed. Vincent directed a sustained passive campaign of questions at Dominic regarding a shipping container detained at a New Jersey port facility. The questions were phrased as practical concerns and were in fact nothing of the kind. They were probes carefully constructed to expose any gap between Dominic's stated position and the reality of his operational control. Remy could see the architecture of it clearly from where she was sitting, the way each question connected to the next. Building toward a specific conclusion, Vincent wanted the room to reach without him appearing to push it there. Dominic dismantled every one of them with the quiet patience of someone who has been playing this particular game far longer than his opponent realized. She watched him, the way he held his utensils, the controlled stillness of his posture, the precise economy of every word he chose, nothing wasted, nothing imprecise, every sentence doing exactly the work it was intended to do and nothing else. He was not performing competence. He was simply competent in the way that a structural beam is competent, not by trying but by being exactly what it is. And the car salesman, Walter said, suddenly pushing his half-eaten plate aside. The question was addressed to Dominic, but Walter's eyes moved briefly to Remy. I do not like loose ends. Has the situation been addressed? Seth Wolf is a civilian, Dominic said. He owes a substantial debt, or rather he did. Did Vincent repeated, raising an eyebrow over his wine glass. His financial position has been restructured, Dominic said in the tone of a man discussing something of extremely minor interest. Walter grunted. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. A man who cannot honor his obligations to his own bride cannot be trusted to honor any other kind. Make it thorough. Let the girl see that you protect what belongs to you. Dominic did not look at Remy. It is already in motion, he said. After dinner, Walter asked to speak with Dominic privately in the study. Remy sat in the front sitting room on a stiff brocade sofa and listened to the rain and thought about the phrase, what belongs to you, and what it felt like to be included in that category. Vincent appeared in the doorway. He carried his drink into the room and sat in the chair across from her with the easy confidence of a man on his own territory, which technically he was. You did well at the table, he said. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. Almost. She looked at him steadily. Walter is not easy to impress, Vincent continued. My nephew has brought women to this table before. Walter tolerated them. He has never laughed. She said nothing. Vincent swirled his glass. I have known Dominic his entire life, he said. I was at his father's funeral. I have watched him build everything he has from the ground up, and I can tell you with complete confidence that he does not make impulsive decisions. He does not do anything without calculating it from every angle first. He let that sit. So I find myself wondering, Vincent said, what the calculation was. What made a woman he had never met the correct choice for a move this significant? Remy held his gaze and said, you would have to ask him. Vincent smiled. It did not reach his eyes. He said. His answer was not particularly illuminating. Which is itself illuminating, do you not think? Dominic always has a reason. When he stops sharing his reasons, it means he does not trust the audience. He stood, straightened his jacket. Welcome to the family, Remy, he said pleasantly. I hope you find it everything you are expecting. He walked out. She sat alone on the brocade sofa and listened to the rain and thought about the specific quality of that conversation, while the way it had been structured to seem like small talk, while actually being something else entirely. A probe. The same architecture as his questions at the dinner table, testing for gaps, for uncertainty, for the crack he was looking for. She had not given him one, but she understood clearly now what she was dealing with. The drive back to Westchester was quiet. The rain had intensified. The highway was nearly empty. You did well, Dominic said. He was looking at his tablet again, though she noticed he had not actually scrolled in some time. I lied through the entire meal, she said. You told him the truth about Seth in a way that served our purpose, he said. That is not the same as lying. I used my own humiliation as a bargaining chip. You survived the opening move, he said. He set the tablet down. In this context, survival is the relevant metric. She turned to look at him. What did you do to Seth, she asked. The wine had stripped away some of the careful management she normally applied to her own directness. She wanted the actual answer. Dominic did not pretend not to understand the question. His bank accounts were frozen as of noon, the day after the wedding, he said. Both primary and secondary. The automotive dealership he worked for is a subsidiary of a holding company I have a controlling interest in. He was terminated for documented gross negligence. No severance. She sat very still. His landlord, an associate of mine, served him an eviction notice that same evening. The sports car purchased with my money has been repossessed and is currently waiting to be processed at a salvage yard in Queens. By the end of this week, his credit will be functionally destroyed. He owes $3 million with accruing interest, and the only employment available to him going forward will be the kind that pays in cash and does not ask for a resume. He will not own property. He will not secure financing of any kind. He is, for all practical purposes, erased from polite society. The car moved through the rain. Remy looked at her hands. She thought about the closet, the sound of it, the cheap artificial strawberry cutting through the bleach. She thought about Seth's face at the altar, not guilty, not sorry, just furious at being caught, furious at her for the inconvenience of her own dignity. Do you pity him? Dominic asked. It was not a taunt. It was a genuine question, the kind that was actually asking something. She considered it honestly. No, she said. The words surprised her with how solid it felt. Not thin or uncertain, heavy, true. I do not pity him at all. Dominic studied her for a long moment in the dark. Then he reached across the console between them and placed his hand over hers. His grip was warm and entirely encompassing his rough knuckles against the cold silk of her dress, the cheap diamonds of Seth's ring pressed between their palms. Good, he said quietly, because sympathy is a liability you can no longer afford. He did not take his hand away. They sat in silence while the armored car moved through the rain-slicked dark, and Remy looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift in the architecture of the situation she was living inside, something structural and quiet and not entirely unwelcome. She told herself it was the wine. 3 days passed. The compound operated on a rhythm she gradually mapped. Dominic left before 7 each morning and returned sometime between 9 and midnight, depending on variables she was not yet privy to. Constance managed the household with a precision that was genuinely impressive and a warmth that was genuinely absent. There were 2 other staff members she saw regularly, a man named Garrett, who handled the grounds, and a woman named Sylvia, who did the cooking. And both of them treated her with the particular careful neutrality of people who had learned not to get attached to whoever was currently occupying the primary suite. She worked. She had her laptop transferred along with her other belongings, and she found that the work she could do remotely, the client campaigns and copy reviews and strategy documents that had been her actual life 10 days ago, were both entirely strange and profoundly grounding. They asked nothing from her except competence, and competence she had. In the evenings when Dominic was back and had finished whatever he needed to finish, he came to find her. Not in any romantic sense. He came with information, with the particular classified honesty he had agreed to give her when she set her single condition at the kitchen island. He told her about the family business, the legitimate faces of it, the holding companies and the port contracts, and the construction interests and the parts that were less publicly documented. He told her about Walter's health, which was deteriorating faster than the old man acknowledged. He told her about the succession structure and what it meant that the Eastern Port Network had not yet been signed over. He did not sit far from her when he talked. She noticed this. He chose the chair adjacent to the sofa she used, not the one across from it. She did not remark on it. In exchange, she told him things she had not told anyone. About the 3 years with Seth, what it had actually looked like from the inside, the accumulated small adjustments and compromised preferences and quietly swallowed objections that had added up over time to something that looked like a relationship from outside, but felt from inside like a slow erasure of herself. He listened without commentary, without the reflexive reassurances that most people offered when you told them something difficult, those small, well-meaning interruptions that were actually about the listener's discomfort rather than the speaker's need. He simply listened, and she found that she had not known until now how much she had needed someone to do that. It was on the 5th night that she found the photograph. She had gone into his study to leave a document on his desk, an insurance form Constance had told her needed a signature. The desk was clear, except for a closed laptop and a leather-bound planner. She set the form down and was turning to leave when the partially open drawer caught her eye. She was not the kind of person who looked through other people's things. She opened the drawer anyway. The photograph was in a manila sleeve, the kind used for surveillance photos. She recognized herself immediately. She was standing outside the building in Midtown where her agency occupied the 14th floor, wearing the gray coat she had bought last October, the collar turned up against the wind. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at her phone with an expression she did not think she had ever seen on her own face before, something private and tired and unguarded. The timestamp in the lower corner said 3 months before the wedding. She stood in his study and held the photograph and felt the floor of the situation shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the building's foundation. When Dominic came home that night, she was sitting in the kitchen with the photograph on the marble counter between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. He sat down. I was investigating Seth's financial activity 6 months before the wedding, he said, without preamble, without soft. When I traced the money, it led back to Seth's personal accounts, and his personal accounts had activity that indicated he was living beyond what his legitimate income explained. I had him surveilled. In the process of that surveillance, I became aware of you. She waited. I ran a profile, Dominic said. Standard procedure when someone connected to a financial crime has close personal ties to the subject. You came back clean. No criminal history, no financial irregularities, No connection to any of Seth's associates. You were in the assessment of my people, an uninvolved civilian who happened to be engaged to someone stealing from me. She looked at the photograph. Am I a variable, she said, or a wife? The kitchen was silent long enough that she could hear the ventilation system running in the walls. At the time, Dominic said carefully, you were a variable. She nodded once, set the photograph back on the counter. She thought about the dossier, the fake coffee shop, the fictional persistence, the 6 months of courtship that had never happened. He had known who she was before she knew he existed. It should have felt like a violation. Part of her understood that it was technically exactly that. What it actually felt like was more complicated than that, and she did not have the vocabulary for the more complicated thing yet, so she set it aside. I want to know everything, she said. Not just what is relevant to the cover story. Everything about what Seth was involved in from the beginning. Dominic looked at her for a moment. Then he said, that will take a while. I have nowhere to be, she said. He got up, poured them both coffee, and sat back down and told her. It was 2 hours later, when the coffee had gone cold and the compound had gone entirely quiet around them, that she told him about the phone call. She had not planned to. She had been turning it over since it happened 2 days ago, trying to understand exactly what she had heard and what it meant. She had been in the garden on the east side of the compound, the part that had actual grass and a stone bench that got afternoon sun when her phone rang. She had answered without looking at the screen because she was expecting a call from a client. The voice on the other end spoke 2 sentences before she realized the call was not for her. She repeated those 2 sentences to Dominic, now word for word, exactly as she had heard them. He is getting too close. We moved the timeline up. The voice had been female. She had recognized it instantly. It was Petra Sinclair. Dominic went very still. She called your number, he said. She called a number she thought was someone else's, Remy said. She hung up immediately when I said hello, but I heard it. Who was she calling? He said, though the way he asked it made her think he already had a theory. I do not know, she said. But Petra was my best friend for 11 years, Dominic. I know her voice. She did not sound like someone making a casual call. She sounded like someone who was following a schedule. Dominic sat very still for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds of the compound. And she watched the back of his shoulders and understood that whatever calculation was happening behind those dark eyes was significant. Tomorrow morning, he said, I need you to tell me everything you know about Petra Sinclair's life for the past year. Every detail you can remember. Who she was spending time with. Whether anything changed. Whether there was anyone new. She thought about Petra, about 11 years of friendship, about the spare key Petra had to her apartment and the spare bottle of body lotion in her bathroom, and the easy, unremarkable intimacy of a friendship that had become so foundational she had stopped examining it. I can do that, she said. Dominic turned from the window. His expression was controlled, but underneath the control was something she was learning to read, the quality of stillness that meant he was recalibrating. You did well, he said, and she understood that it was not about the dinner or about Walter or about anything she had said at the mahogany table. It was about this. She nodded. She gathered the cold coffee cups and put them in the sink and went upstairs, and she lay in the dark of the primary suite and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that her best friend's voice had been on the other end of a misdirected phone call, 2 sentences long and entirely wrong. She had trusted Petra the way you trust the floor beneath your feet, without examination, without proof, as a condition of walking forward. She was beginning to understand that in the world she had walked into, that kind of trust was the most dangerous kind there was. She thought about what Dominic had said at the kitchen table the very first morning. In my world, ignoring cracks gets you killed. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. She was not going to ignore this one. She lay there for another hour, thinking through everything she knew about Petra with the same systematic attention she brought to client work, which was she was beginning to understand one of the more useful things about her that had nothing to do with the world she had accidentally married into. She was good at looking at available information and finding the shape of what it was trying to tell her. She had been trained to do it. She had spent a decade doing it for other people's products and campaigns and quarterly goals. She could do it for this. By the time the first gray light began separating the tree line from the sky outside her window, she had the outline of it. Not all the details, not the full picture, but the shape, the recognizable silhouette of a plan that had been running longer than she had understood. Barisco built around people she had trusted, designed to use the ordinary texture of her daily life as the scaffolding for something she was never meant to see. She got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen island with a legal pad and began to write. The week after Remy told Dominic about the phone call was the quietest and most dangerous week of her life. Quiet on the surface. The compound continued its rhythm. Constance moved through the halls with her precise silence. Sylvia cooked. Garrett tended the grounds. The household operated exactly as it always had, and if you were watching from outside, you would have seen nothing unusual at all. Underneath that surface, everything was moving. Dominic spent 3 days reviewing surveillance records she was not permitted to see and making calls she was not in the room for, and he came back to her each evening with new information delivered in the same to a quiet factual register he used for everything, as though the systematic unraveling of a conspiracy that had been running inside his own organization for the better part of a year was simply another item on the agenda. She spent those 3 days doing what he had asked. She went through 11 years of friendship with Petra Sinclair. The way you go through a house after a flood, carefully, methodically looking at everything and deciding what was salvageable and what had been damaged past the point of recovery. What she found when she looked at it honestly was a pattern she had not allowed herself to see while she was standing inside it. Petra, who had introduced her to Seth at a gallery opening 18 months ago. Petra, who had been the one to suggest the venue for the wedding, a venue owned, as Remy now knew, by a subsidiary of a company with documented ties to the Harrow family's business network. Petra, who had always asked thoughtful, interested questions about Seth's work and never about Remy's, which Remy had always attributed to Petra finding finance more interesting than marketing, and which she now understood as something else entirely. She laid it all out for Dominic on the third evening, sitting at the kitchen island, with a legal pad covered in her own handwriting, every data point she could retrieve from memory organized into a timeline. He read it without speaking. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who has received confirmation of something he had theorized but not yet proven. She was placed, he said. Remy had already reached this conclusion, but hearing it stated plainly still landed with weight. Petra was positioned inside my life before Seth was, she said, before any of this started. Dominic nodded slowly. Vincent made contact with Seth approximately 9 months before the wedding, he said. He offered Seth a financial arrangement access to certain accounts in exchange for a percentage of whatever Seth could extract before the discrepancy was discovered. The plan was to create a documented financial crime traceable to Seth, which would then be used to suggest that my personal vetting process was compromised, that I was either negligent or complicit. Either conclusion would give Vincent grounds to challenge my fitness to take control of the port network. And Petra, Remy said, was recruited approximately 3 months before Seth. Dominic said. Her function was intelligence. To monitor your movements, your conversations, your access to any information about my operations, and to report back. She also served as insurance. If at any point the situation needed to be escalated, her proximity to you gave Vincent a lever. Remy looked at the legal pad in front of her. 11 years, she said. She was an asset for 18 months, Dominic said. 11 years is still real. It simply ends differently than you expected. She appreciated that he did not try to minimize it further. She appreciated that he did not offer her comfort that would have required him to be less accurate. Who was she calling, Remy asked. When she misdirected that call to me, Vincent, Dominic said. He looked at her directly. She was calling Vincent to tell him that I had begun asking questions about Seth's associates, that I was getting close to the shape of what had been arranged. She was telling him to accelerate whatever he had planned next. And what had he planned next? The Harrow Foundation benefit, Dominic said. The Plaza, 3 weeks from now, annual family event, every significant ally and associate in attendance. Walter uses it to take the temperature of the family's relationships each year. Vincent has been planning to use it as the venue to make his challenge public. He paused. He now has what he believes is the perfect ammunition, Dominic continued. Constance provided him with a copy of our original contract 2 days ago. Remy went very still. Constance, she said. She has been Vincent's inside the household for 15 years, Dominic said. She provided him with documentation of our arrangement, the terms, the duration, the financial structure. Vincent intends to produce that document at the benefit in front of Walter in the full assembly and use it to demonstrate that my marriage is a fabrication designed to manipulate my grandfather's succession conditions. She thought about Constance, the severe silver hair, the ramrod posture, The 2-second measuring look on the night Remy arrived in a wedding dress and was assigned a bedroom without ceremony. The woman had been in this house for 15 years, moving through its rooms with the quiet efficiency of someone who belonged there, and she had been watching and reporting the entire time. "You knew," Remy said. "I suspected," Dominic said. "I confirmed it yesterday." She took a breath. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" "Because I needed to know the full scope before I changed anything," he said. If Constance had sensed that she was under scrutiny, she would have warned Vincent, and Vincent would have altered his approach. I needed him to believe he still had the advantage. She understood the logic. She did not entirely like it because it meant she had been living in the same house as someone who was actively working against them without being told, but she understood it. "What do you need from me?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I need you at the benefit," he said. 3 weeks. I need you to continue exactly as you have been. Give Constance nothing that changes her reporting to Vincent. I need him to believe his plan is intact. And at the benefit itself, at the benefit, he said, we let him move first. She nodded slowly. "And after he moves." He paused. Something in his expression shifted a fraction of the controlled surface, giving way to something underneath it. "After he moves," he said, "I need you to do what you did at St. Augustine's." She looked at him. "I need you to tell the truth," he said, "in front of all of them." 3 weeks. She memorized more. She studied the family structure, the business relationships, the history of the Harrow organization going back 2 generations. She read the documents Dominic provided with the same focused attention she gave to client strategy, briefs, looking for patterns, for leverage points, for the places where the official story and the actual story diverged. She ran in the mornings along the ridge road, the compound's grounds too manicured and geometric for her taste, and she thought while she ran. She thought about 11 years of friendship dismantled into a timeline. She thought about Seth somewhere in the city, now working cash jobs and looking over his shoulder. She thought about the photograph in the manila envelope, herself in a gray coat outside a building in Midtown, unaware of being watched, wearing an expression she now understood as the face of a woman who was already tired of the life she was living and had not yet admitted it to herself. She thought about this version of herself who had stood in a bridal suite 11 weeks ago and looked in the mirror and seen someone who had arranged herself carefully and over a long period of time into the shape of a life she had not actually chosen, who had mistaken the absence of overt unhappiness for contentment, who had confused the work of maintaining a relationship with the relationship itself. That woman had thrown a match without fully understanding what she was lighting. She was grateful for it anyway. Constance continued to move through the household with her silver-haired precision, and Remy was courteous to her and gave her nothing. In the evenings, Dominic came to find her, and they sat together in the kitchen or the sitting room and talked through things, the case he was building, the positions of the relevant players, the vulnerabilities in Vincent's strategy. The conversations grew longer. They started later and ended well past midnight. She stopped noticing the precise hour when she finally went upstairs. She noticed other things instead. The way he poured her coffee without asking how she took it, because he had already learned. The way he stopped what he was doing when she walked into a room, a pause so brief it was almost nothing, but she had spent weeks learning to read the small things. The way his expression, always so controlled, always so precisely maintained, became slightly less so, somewhere around the second hour of conversation, when the strategic layer of the evening had been covered, and what was left was simply 2 people talking in a quiet house. She did not name what was happening. Naming it felt like reaching for something in the dark, the kind of movement that either closes your hand around what you were looking for or disturbs it entirely. She left it alone. She let it be what it was, present and unannounced, the way the best things tend to be when you have stopped trying to manage them into a shape you can recognize. On one of those evenings, 12 days before the benefit, she asked him the question she had been holding for a while. "What happens to you," she said, "if this does not work? If Vincent presents the contract and Walter believes him?" Dominic was quiet for a moment. "I lose the port network," he said. "Vincent takes operational control. My standing within the family structure is significantly diminished. The people who currently work with me, because of what I represent, will reassess their relationships." She looked at him. "And what happens to you personally, not operationally?" He met her eyes. It was a simple question that she understood was not simple at all, and she watched him weigh whether to answer it honestly. "I have spent 15 years building something," he said finally. "Not just the business, the structure, the way things operate within my organization, the protections it provides, the stability. If Vincent takes control, that changes. He has different values about what the organization is for and who it is accountable to. She understood what he was not saying, which was that some of what kept certain things stable and certain people protected depended entirely on who was running things and why. "We are not going to let that happen," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in the controlled surface of his expression was very slightly different than usual, quality she had been learning to read over the course of weeks. The barely perceptible shift that meant something had landed differently than anticipated. "No," he said, "we are not." The night before the benefit, Constance left. Not fled, not dramatically. She simply was not at the compound in the morning. Her room was cleared with the same thoroughness she had applied to every other task she had ever performed there. Nothing left, nothing disordered, the bed made with hospital corners for the last time. Dominic had known she would go. She had been told through a carefully constructed chain of apparent accident that her access to the household would be reviewed following the benefit. She had drawn the correct conclusion and removed herself before that could happen. It was as Dominic explained it to Remy over coffee the morning of the benefit, the most efficient outcome. No confrontation, no scene, no requirement to involve anyone in anything unpleasant. But Remy found she was sitting with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was probably something between them. "She trusted me with things," Remy said. "Small things. Where she kept the good linen. What coffee I preferred. She showed me how the house worked." Dominic was quiet. "I know she was Vincent's," Remy said. "I know what she was doing. I just want to note that it is possible to be an instrument of something and still be real in the smaller moments. I am not mourning her, I am just noting the distinction." Dominic looked at her in a way he had been looking at her more frequently over the past week. The way that was not the chess piece assessment of their early days, but something that had fewer walls around it. "Noted," he said. She nodded, finished her coffee, set the cup in the sink. She said, "What time does the car leave?" 7, he said. She went upstairs to get dressed. The Plaza Hotel in the early evening was a particular kind of beautiful. The kind that has been maintained so long and so carefully that it no longer needs to announce itself. Gold and marble and the weight of chandeliers that have been hanging in the same positions for 100 years. The Harrow Foundation benefit occupied the grand ballroom, and by the time Remy and Dominic arrived, the room was already full. She wore midnight blue. Not the oxblood silk of the Long Island dinner. This was her own choice, a dress she had selected herself from the options brought to the compound, structured at the shoulders, clean through the body, nothing that required anyone's strategic input. She wore her hair down for the first time since the wedding. Simple, entirely herself. Dominic wore black. They moved through the room together, and she watched the effect of his presence, with the attention she had been developing for weeks. The subtle recalibration that happened in people's posture when he came within a certain radius. The way conversations paused and reoriented. The small, careful adjustments that powerful people make when they recognize something more powerful in the room. She was steady beside him, and she was not performing the steadiness. It was simply there. She spotted Vincent 20 minutes after they arrived. He was working the room with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this for decades, moving from group to group, a hand on a shoulder here, a private word there, building something with each interaction. She watched him and understood clearly and without drama that he had been doing exactly this for months, quietly, methodically, one relationship at a time. Walter arrived at 8, assisted by a man she did not recognize, in the silver-tipped cane. He looked smaller than he had at Long Island, the oxygen tank at his side, his movement more careful. But his eyes, when they found her across the room, were the same, sharp and layered and reading everything they landed on. She crossed to him. "Mr. Harrow," she said. "Remy," Walter said. He looked at her for a moment. "You look like yourself tonight." She was not sure if that was a compliment. She decided to take it as one. "Stay close," Walter said quietly, and turned to speak to someone else. It happened at 9:15. Vincent moved to the small raised platform at the front of the room where the Foundation's representatives had spoken earlier in the evening. He did not take the microphone at first. He simply stood there in the way he had, heavy and self-possessed, until the conversations in his immediate vicinity quieted, and then the quiet spread outward through the room, the way these things always spread, not all at once but in a widening ring, until the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was nearly silent and 200 people were looking at him. He smiled, a warm smile, practiced and warm and entirely without warmth underneath. I want to take a moment, Vincent said, to speak about something that I think many of us in this room have been thinking about over the past weeks. Something that touches on the question of what this family stands for and how we represent that to the world. He paused. His gaze moved through the room and found Dominic. Then it moved to Remy. My nephew's recent marriage has been, he said, a matter of some discussion, a spontaneous decision, dramatic circumstances. A woman none of us knew introduced to the family without the usual considerations. I want to be clear that I mean no disrespect to Remy personally when I say that the speed and the nature of this arrangement has raised legitimate questions that I believe Walter and this family deserve to have answered honestly. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a document. He held it up. I have here, he said, a copy of the contractual agreement that governs this marriage. Terms, duration, financial compensation. 1 year. Structured transactional and designed as far as I can determine specifically to satisfy the succession requirements that Walter has outlined for the transfer of the Eastern Port Network. I do not believe, he said, his voice carrying cleanly through the silent ballroom, that my nephew has married for the reasons we are being asked to believe. And I believe that Walter deserves to make his decision about succession with full and accurate information. He lowered the document. 200 people held their breath. Remy was already moving. She did not consult Dominic. She did not look at him. She moved through the crowd toward the platform in the way she had learned to move through difficult rooms without hesitation, without announcing herself until she was already where she needed to be. She stepped up onto the platform. Vincent looked at her with surprise he could not entirely contain. She took the microphone. She looked out at 200 people. He is right, she said. Her voice was clear and steady and traveled to every corner of the room. There is a contract. He is holding a copy of it, and its contents are exactly what he says they are. I signed it 48 hours after my original wedding ceremony fell apart in a way that most of you have probably already heard about. It was a business arrangement, 1 year, defined terms. I want to be completely honest with all of you about that because the alternative is allowing someone else to define what it means. And I have spent enough of my life allowing other people to narrate my story for me. She paused. She looked at Vincent. What my husband's uncle has chosen not to include in his presentation, she said, is the context for why this arrangement exists and who created the conditions that made it necessary. She looked at Walter. 9 months before my original wedding, she said Vincent Harrow approached Seth Wolf, the man I was engaged to, and offered him a financial arrangement. Seth was given access to certain accounts and encouraged to extract funds with the understanding that Vincent would provide cover. The purpose was not to harm Seth. Seth was a means to an end. The purpose was to create a documented financial crime that could be laid at Dominic's door or used to suggest that his judgment and his operational security were compromised. The timing was not accidental. It was designed to land in the months before Walter made his decision about succession. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of an audience waiting to hear something. It was the silence of people recalibrating in real time. My maid of honor was recruited 3 months before Seth. Remy continued. Her function was to monitor my access to information and report back. She was also, as it happened, the person Seth was involved with in a supply closet on our wedding day, which I mention not as a personal detail, but because it is relevant to understanding the full structure of what was arranged. Everything that happened at St. Augustine's Church, including the circumstances that led Dominic to walk through those doors, was the result of a plan that had been running for the better part of a year, designed and executed by the man standing next to me on this platform. She turned and looked directly at Vincent. I did not marry Dominic Harrow because I had no options, she said. I married him because I made a decision with the information I had available under circumstances that someone in this room deliberately engineered to be as destabilizing as possible. And I am still here 4 months later, not because a piece of paper requires it, but because I chose to stay. You can question the beginning of this marriage. What you cannot honestly question is who has been working against this family and who has been working for it. She looked back at Walter. The contract was for 1 year, she said. I am still here because I chose to be. I would like someone in this room to ask Vincent Harrow whether he can say the same about anything he has done for this family. The grand ballroom was absolutely silent. Vincent's face had undergone a series of rapid adjustments that had settled finally into something flat and still. and very cold. The warm practiced smile was entirely gone. What was underneath it was not pleasant. He looked at Walter. Walter had not moved. The old man sat very still in his chair, with his silver-tipped cane between his hands, and his clouded dark eyes moving between his nephew and the woman who had just finished speaking, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has now watched it happen exactly as he anticipated. He stood up. The room shifted around him. Walter was small and frail and moved carefully, and none of that mattered at all, because he stood up in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, and 200 people fell completely silent in the way that rooms fall silent when the person who actually holds authority in them decides to speak. He looked at Vincent for a long moment. "I have known about the arrangement with Seth Wolf since February," Walter said. His voice was the wet, rasping thing it always was, and it carried to every corner of the room anyway. "I have known about the recruitment of the woman who served as Remy's maid of honor since March. I have known about Constance since April." A sound moved through the room. Not words, just the collective breath of 200 people understanding something simultaneously. "I did not have documentation," Walter said. "I had intelligence, and I had instinct, and I had 40 years of watching people in this family make decisions, and what I did not have was a witness who would stand in a room full of everyone who matters and tell the truth without being asked, and without being coached, and without calculating first whether it was safe." He looked at Remy. "I have that now," he said. He looked back at Vincent. "You have mistaken." Walter said the patience of a man who is dying for the weakness of a man who does not know what is happening. "I have been waiting for you to show me the full shape of what you were willing to do. You have now shown me." Vincent opened his mouth. "We will speak privately," Walter said. "Tonight, you and I and the attorneys. That conversation is not for this room." He turned away from his nephew as though the matter was already settled, which it was. He looked at Dominic. "The Eastern Port Network transfers on Monday," Walter said. "Draw up the documentation." Dominic nodded once. Walter looked at Remy for a long moment. "You are too thin," he said, "and you have excellent instincts. Sit down and have something to eat." She exhaled slowly. She stepped down from the platform. Dominic was there. He did not say anything. He placed his hand at the small of her back and guided her away from the platform and through the crowd which parted for them, and she kept her eyes level and her spine straight until they reached the edge of the room where it was quieter and the press of people was less immediate. She became aware that her hands were shaking very slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "You did not tell me Walter already knew," she said. "No," Dominic said. She looked at him. "If I had told you he said you would have known there was a safety net, you would have spoken differently. What Walter needed was someone who told the truth because it was the truth, not because they knew it was going to be received a certain way." She thought about this. "So you let me walk up there, not knowing whether it was going to work?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily for a long moment. "That," she said, "is a violation of the deal we made." He held her gaze. "It is," he said. She nodded slowly. She looked back out at the room. Vincent had been quietly and efficiently surrounded by two men she recognized from Dominic's organization and was being guided toward a side exit with the professional smoothness of people who had handled more resistant situations than this. Seth Wolf left New York before the month was out. She heard through no effort of her own that he had relocated to a city where no one knew his name and was working jobs that required no references and left no paper trail. She did not think about him often. When she did, she felt nothing in particular, which she understood was its own kind of answer. The 3 years she had spent building a life around him had not been wasted exactly. They had simply been the long way around to understanding what she actually needed, which turned out to be almost nothing like what she had thought. Petra Sinclair left the week after the benefit. Remy found out through a mutual acquaintance, not through any direct contact between them. There was no confrontation. There was nothing left to confront. 11 years of friendship had been real in the way that all things are real before you understand what they were built on. The gallery openings, the late-night phone calls, the easy shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to stop finishing sentences, all of it had happened. All of it had been genuine on Remy's side at least, and she chose to believe that some portion of it had been genuine on Petra's side as well, whatever that was worth. She did not grieve it the way she had expected to. She filed it away in the same place she kept the crescent moon scuff mark on the linoleum floor of St. Augustine's, a detail from a life she had already left behind. Constance was not replaced. Remy found she preferred managing the household herself, or rather, she found she preferred a household that felt inhabited rather than administered. Sylvia stayed. Garrett stayed. The compound began slowly and without ceremony to feel like somewhere a person could actually live. The evening of the benefit, they drove home in the quiet that had become familiar between them. The city thinned out behind them. The highway opened up. The rain that had threatened all evening finally came light and steady, the kind that does not demand attention but simply is. She looked out at it and thought about the past 4 months. She thought about the woman who had stood in a bridal suite with waterproof mascara and no plan, listening to the sound of her own life coming apart, and who had walked out of that room and down a hallway and made a decision in the span of 30 seconds that had changed everything. She had not known in that moment what she was walking toward. She had only known what she was walking away from, and she had been so thoroughly done with it that the direction had not mattered. Direction had a way of becoming clear when you stopped standing still. She thought about the contract. The clean transactional clarity of it, the way it had felt like a container with walls and a lid and a clearly marked expiration date. The kind of structure that a person who has just had their life demolished finds comforting because it promises a defined boundary around the damage. She had signed it thinking it was a temporary shelter, something to stand inside while she figured out what came next. She had not anticipated that what came next might be this. Dominic did not speak on the drive. He did not look at his tablet. He sat beside her in the dark and looked out his own window, and she understood that whatever was happening in the silence for him was significant, was the same kind of significant as what was happening in her own silence. Two people separately arriving at the same place from the same direction without having said a word about the journey. They went inside. The house was quiet. The kitchen was dark except for the low light Sylvia always left above the stove. The polished slate floors reflected the distant illumination from the grounds. The whole house smelled faintly of the dinner Sylvia had left covered on the stove, and of the pine air that came through when the windows were open, clean and cold and real. Remy stood in the middle of the kitchen and became aware that she was very tired. Not the hollow adrenaline crash exhaustion of the wedding day. Something different. The tiredness of a person who has been running at a particular sustained intensity and has now arrived unexpectedly at a place where they can stop. The kind of tired that is not depletion, but completion. The feeling of a thing done and done right, and finally after a long time set down. She reached up and unclipped her earrings, set them on the island counter. The contract, she said. Dominic had stopped a few feet away. He was watching her with the quality of attention that had no calculation in it, the kind she had seen develop slowly over 4 months, the kind that was simply him paying attention to her because he wanted to. She looked at him. I know what the contract says, she said. I know when it ends. I have been aware of the date since the morning you slid the folder across this counter. She pressed her fingers flat on the marble surface. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly, because we agreed on no shadows, and you violated that agreement this evening, and I am choosing not to hold it against you, but I need you to be honest with me right now. He was very still. What do you want, she asked when the year is done. The kitchen was quiet. Dominic looked at her in the low light with his dark eyes and the controlled stillness that she had spent 4 months learning to read, and for once, for the first time, she watched him make a decision not to control it. You, he said, simply and without surrounding it with anything else. She breathed. She looked down at her left hand, the thin white gold band, the small cloudy diamonds. Seth's ring, which had been sitting on her finger for 4 months as an instrument of narrative convenience, and which had been digging into her skin in the way of things that do not fit. She took it off. She set it on the counter. It sat there in the low kitchen light, catching nothing, throwing no reflections, a small and entirely unremarkable object that had once meant something and now simply did not. She looked back at Dominic. I have a condition, she said. He almost smiled. I need you to tell me the truth, she said, not the operationally relevant truth, not the version that has been assessed for what I can handle. All of it. Whatever this is going forward, it happens without shadows. Both directions. He held her gaze. Both directions means you tell me things as well, he said. Yes, she said, including the things you have been not saying for the past 4 months because you were categorizing them as irrelevant to the arrangement. She looked at him for a moment. I thought you were supposed to be the dangerous one, she said. He did smile then briefly and genuinely, the rare expression that changed the entire architecture of his face. And she stored it the way she had been storing things for months, carefully, in the place where she kept the information that mattered. There are two conditions, he said. She raised an eyebrow. He crossed the kitchen. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and set a small box on the counter beside the ring. She looked at it. No contract, this time, he said. No terms, no duration. She looked up at him. She thought about her life 4 months ago. The carefully maintained smile, the paint color arguments. The 3 years of quiet erosion that she had told herself was compromise, because compromise was what reasonable adults did in reasonable relationships. And she had been so committed to being reasonable that she had reasoned herself into someone she did not recognize. She looked at the box on the counter, then at the man standing beside it. Then I need the truth first, she said. All of it, tonight. He pulled out the stool on his side of the island and sat down. He began to talk. She settled against the counter and listened to him the way he had always listened to her, without the small interruptions, without the management of his own discomfort. Just the full and unguarded attention of one person choosing to be honest with another in a kitchen in the middle of the night. Outside, the light rain continued its steady, quiet work against the windows. The dark pines stood motionless below the ridge. The city hummed its continuous low notes somewhere far to the south, indifferent and unchanging, and entirely unaware of what was happening in this kitchen, which was, she thought, exactly right. The best things happen in rooms the world is not watching. Inside, the two of them stayed at the counter and talked until the low light above the stove was the only thing keeping the dark from the edges of the room. They talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, about the business and about the past and about the small, unremarkable details of two lives that had not been designed to intersect and had intersected anyway, loudly and publicly, and in the middle of a church, and had been quietly finding their way toward each other ever since. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the feeling of being exactly where they chose to be. Remy Callahan had found it in the ruins of the worst days she had ever lived through, in the kitchen of a glass fortress, on a hill across a marble counter, from a man who had once walked into a church to collect a debt and had ended up, over the course of 4 months and 7 kinds of fire, earning something he had not known to look for. She was not going to let it go. Neither of them noticed the hours passing. Neither of them needed to. The small box sat on the counter between them, unopened, patient, waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived and was not being rushed. There was no hurry. They had both spent long enough inside lives that moved too fast and asked too much and delivered too little. They could afford to take their time with this one. They had, in fact, decided to.